Foundations of Grit and Dust. The wind in the Nebraska Territory did not blow, it scoured. It carried with it the fine, alkaline silt of 1,000 miles of untouched prairie, a gray grit that found its way into the seams of heavy wool coats, the pores of weathered skin, and the very souls of those brave or desperate enough to claim it. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of his claim, 160 acres of golden-brown bunch grass and hidden buffalo wallows. In his hand, he held a rusted spade, its edge dulled by the stubborn sod that the locals called Nebraska marble. To a city man from Philadelphia, this was a wasteland. To Elias, it was the first thing he had ever truly owned. The weight of the past. Elias wasn't alone in his struggle. Behind him, huddled in the lee of a half-finished sod house, was his younger brother, Silas. Silas was a boy of 19 who still carried the soldier shake in his hands, a lingering ghost of the siege of Vicksburg. They had come west not for gold, but for the silence. The east was too loud with the echoes of cannon fire and the mourning veils of widows. Here, there was only the wind and the daunting, beautiful indifference of the horizon. "The plow won't break it, Elias," Silas called out, his voice thin against the gale. He was leaning against the wagon, his face pale. "The oxen are spent. We're digging into a mountain that doesn't want to be moved." Elias didn't look back. He shoved the spade into the earth with a rhythmic thud. "It's not a mountain, Si. It's a floor. And once we have a floor, we have a home. Tomorrow the sun will be higher and the frost will be gone. We keep digging." A meeting of two worlds. Their isolation was broken on the third week of April by the rhythmic drumming of hooves. It wasn't the heavy clatter of a cavalry troop, but the light, purposeful gait of unshod ponies. Elias dropped his spade and reached for the Henry rifle leaning against the wagon wheel. 3 riders appeared on the crest of the northern ridge. They were Lakota, draped in buffalo robes that fluttered like dark wings. They didn't approach with weapons drawn, but they didn't smile either. They sat like statues, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the approaching storm. One rider, an older man with skin like polished mahogany, rode forward. He looked at the jagged hole Elias had torn into the earth, the foundation, and then at the 2 haggard men. He spoke no English, but he pointed at the clouds, then at the low ground near the creek a mile away. He made a gesture of a rising wave. "What's he saying?" Silas whispered, his hand white-knuckled on the wagon sideboard. "He's warning us," Elias said, his eyes tracking the dark, swirling mass of the sky. "He thinks we're in the wrong place." Elias looked at his hole in the ground, the hours of back-breaking labor. The sweat turned to mud on his brow. To move now was to admit defeat to the land before they had even begun. He shoved the spade into the earth with a rhythmic thud. "It's not a mountain, Si. It's a floor. And once we have a floor, we have a home. Tomorrow the sun will be higher and the frost will be gone. We keep digging." A trial of water and earth. The storm hit at midnight. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge that turned the dry creek bed, which Elias had ignored, into a roaring throat of brown water. The sod house, the dream they had been building, began to melt. The unbaked mud bricks saturated and slumped. Silas screamed as the western wall buckled, pinning his leg under a heap of heavy wet earth. "Elias, I can't move!" Elias fought through knee-deep sludge, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs. He dug with his bare hands, his fingernails tearing against the very sod he had prized so much. He felt the cold terror of the frontier then, the realization that the land didn't hate them, it simply didn't care if they lived or died. He hauled Silas free, just as the rest of the roof collapsed into the mire. They spent the night huddled under a soaked canvas tarp, shivering in the mud, watching their foundation wash away into the dark. The dawn of resilience. When the sun rose, the world was scoured clean. The prairie looked different, vibrant, terrifyingly green, and steaming under the heat. Their tools were buried, their supplies dampened, and their shelter was a tomb of mud. Silas sat on a rock, his leg bruised and swollen. "We should go back, Elias. There's nothing for us here but a shallow grave." Elias looked at his hands. They were caked with the gray dust that had now turned to a permanent stain under his nails. He looked at the ridge where the Lakota had stood. They had survived the night. The foundation of their new life wasn't the mud house or the claim markers. It was the grit in their own bones. "We aren't going back," Elias said, his voice rasping but firm. "We're moving to the high ground by the creek, just like the old man showed us. We'll use the stone from the draws this time. Mud is for the valley. Stone is for the heights." He picked up the spade, wiped the silt from the blade, and started walking. He didn't look back at the ruin. In the American West, the past was a weight that could drown you. Only the next step mattered.
This second movement of the story, the Crucible of Divided Loyalties, shifts the narrative forward into a period of intense social and political friction. As the 1860s bleed into the 1870s, the grit of survival turns into the fire of conflicting allegiances. The Crucible of Divided Loyalties. By 1872, the settlement of Oakhaven had grown from a collection of sod huts into a bustling frontier town. The railroad, the great iron serpent, had finally arrived, bringing with it the hum of telegraph wires and the arrival of strangers. Elias Thorne, once a desperate man digging in the mud, was now a man of standing, his stone house on the ridge serving as a landmark for miles. But prosperity had brought a different kind of storm, the lingering, bitter ghosts of the Civil War and the encroaching greed of the land syndicates. The gathering storm. The town's tavern, the Gilded Spur, became the epicenter of a new conflict. On one side of the room sat the Unionists, men like Elias who believed the war was over and the law of the federal government was absolute. On the other side sat the Bushwhackers, displaced Southerners and disgruntled veterans who saw the railroad as an instrument of Northern tyranny. The tension broke on a humid Tuesday evening when a representative of the Pacific Rail Company, a man named Sterling Vance, arrived with a ledger full of title corrections. "The government grants was specific, Mr. Thorne," Vance said, tapping a map spread across the tavern's scarred oak table. "Your northern 40 acres and the land belonging to your neighbors, the Millers, technically falls within the railroad's right-of-way. We are prepared to offer a pittance in compensation, or you can vacate." Elias felt the old heat rise in his chest. "I bled into that soil before there was a track within 300 miles of here, Vance. That land isn't a line on your map. It's my brother's sweat and my own." The house divided. The conflict didn't just stay in the tavern. It crept into Elias's own home. Silas, his younger brother, had never truly recovered his spirit after the war. While Elias sought stability, Silas found kinship with the disgruntled Bushwhackers. He had begun riding with a group led by Caleb Stone, a former Confederate raider who preached that the railroad was a Yankee monster designed to starve the small farmer. One night, Elias found Silas cleaning a Navy Colt revolver by the fireplace. "Caleb says we're going to stop the midnight freight. They're hauling gold and legal documents that would evict half the county. If those papers never reach the circuit court, the land stays ours." "That's banditry, Silas," Elias warned, his voice low. If you fire on that train, you aren't fighting for your land. You're fighting against the very peace we came here to find. You're choosing a side that's already lost. I'm choosing a side that doesn't treat me like a dog," Silas snapped, standing up. "You've become a law and order man because you have something to lose. I have nothing but a bruised leg and a name the government wants to erase." The midnight stand. The Crucible reached its boiling point at the Blackwood Trestle, a massive timber bridge 3 miles east of town. Elias, alerted by a sense of impending doom, rode out into the moonless night. He wasn't riding to support the railroad. He was riding to save his brother from the gallows. He found the group, 6 men in masks, stacking dry brush and oil barrels on the tracks. Caleb Stone stood at the center, a torch flickering in his hand, his eyes wild with a revolutionary's fervor. "Step aside, Elias," Caleb shouted as Elias rode into the circle of light. "I'm not here for the railroad, Caleb," Elias said, his rifle resting across his saddle. "I'm here for the boy. Silas, get on your horse. We go home and we fight this in the courts. This ends in blood, and it won't be the railroad's, it'll be yours." The sound of the distant whistle echoed through the canyon. The ground began to vibrate. Silas stood between the 2 men, his gaze darting from the brother who had pulled him from the mud to the leader who offered him vengeance. "He's a traitor to his own kind, Silas," Caleb hissed. "He's a collaborator." Caleb raised the torch to the oil. In that split second, Silas made his choice. He didn't fire on the train. He stepped forward and knocked the torch from Caleb's hand, crushing the flames into the dirt. "No more fire, Caleb. I'm tired of burning things down." The aftermath of loyalty. The train roared past, a blur of iron and steam, unaware of how close it had come to disaster. Caleb and his men, realizing the element of surprise was gone and the law would be coming, vanished into the shadows of the hills. Elias and Silas stood alone on the tracks. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the train. The bond between them was cracked, if not broken. Silas had saved the train, but in doing so, he had betrayed the only men who made him feel like a soldier again. Elias had saved his brother, but he knew the railroad would still come for their land the next morning, now with the added weight of legal authority. "They'll still take it, won't they?" Silas asked, looking at the retreating lights of the caboose. "They'll try," Elias said, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. "But now we fight as men of the law, not as ghosts of the war. That's the hardest loyalty of all, Si, staying true to the future when the past is so much easier to hold on to." As they rode back towards Oakhaven, the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. The dust of the frontier was still there, but it was now mixed with the cold ash of burnt loyalties. They were no longer just survivors. They were participants in the messy, violent birth of a nation's order.
This final movement, legacy carved in stone and blood, brings the journey of the Thorne brothers to its powerful conclusion. It explores the ultimate price of peace and what remains when the dust of the frontier finally settles. Legacy carved in stone and blood. The year was 1890. The frontier, once an endless sea of grass and lawlessness, had been fenced, gridded, and tamed. Oakhaven was no longer a cluster of sod houses. It was a city of brick and mortar, a monument to the grit and dust of 30 years prior. Elias Thorne was an old man now, his hair the color of the Nebraska winter, his hands gnarled like the roots of the cottonwood trees he had planted along the creek. But the peace he had spent his life building was built on a foundation of sacrifice, and the blood of the past was about to demand its final due. The return of the ghost. The conflict that had simmered for decades over the railroad land titles had never truly died. It had merely evolved. The bushwhackers of the old days had been replaced by desperate squatters and a new generation of outlaws who saw Elias as the embodiment of the establishment they loathed. In the center of this new unrest was a man named Julian Stone, the son of Caleb Stone. He didn't carry a torch for a cause, he carried a grudge for a father who had died in a territorial prison. Julian arrived in Oak Haven not to protest the law, but to tear down the man who had helped write it. One evening, as a blood-red sun dipped below the horizon, Julian and a band of riders surrounded the Thorne Ranch. They didn't come with legal papers, they came with Winchesters and a bottle of kerosene. The final stand at the Stone House. Elias stood on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, the stone house that had replaced the mud hut of his youth. Silas, older and slower, but with eyes that still held the sharp glint of a soldier, stood beside him. "It's come full circle, hasn't it, Elias?" Silas whispered, checking the action on his rifle. "We started in the mud, and it looks like we'll end in the stone." "I don't regret a single day, Silas," Elias replied. "We didn't just build a house, we built a place where the law matters. If we fall tonight, we fall for the right things." The first shot shattered the window glass. The Crucible had returned, but this time there would be no retreat. Blood on the threshold. The battle for the Thorne Ranch lasted until the small hours of the morning. It was a brutal, intimate affair. Silas moved with the phantom grace of his youth, defending the rear stables, while Elias held the main hall. But age is a cruel master. In the chaos, a bullet found Silas. He fell against the very stone walls he had helped haul from the draws decades ago. Elias let out a roar of grief that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Ignoring the lead whistling through the air, he charged into the yard. He wasn't a statesman or a landowner in that moment. He was a pioneer protecting his kin. He met Julian Stone in the center of the dust-choked yard. Julian raised his pistol, but his eyes faltered. He saw in Elias not a collaborator, but a titan, a man who had survived the melting sod, the raging floods, and the changing tides of history. Elias's shot was true. Julian fell, the torch slipping from his hand and dying out in the dirt. The remaining riders, seeing their leader fallen and the ferocity of the old man, broke and vanished into the night. The weight of the legacy. Elias knelt in the dust, cradling Silas's head. The younger brother looked up at the stone house, then at the stars. "The foundation held, Elias," Silas rasped, a faint smile touching his blood-streaked lips. "The stone, it didn't melt. It held, Si, because of you," Elias sobbed. Don't let them forget. It wasn't just the land. It was the grit." With a final shallow breath, Silas was gone. The boy who survived Vicksburg and the Great Flood had finally found his silence. Carved in stone. Weeks later, the town of Oak Haven gathered at the crest of the ridge. They didn't gather for a railroad celebration or a political rally. They gathered to dedicate a monument. Elias had refused a bronze statue in the town square. Instead, he had a massive granite slab hauled to the spot where their first sod house had collapsed in the storm of 1860. On it, he didn't list his own titles or achievements. He had a simple inscription carved: "For those who turn the dust into destiny, we bled so the foundation would not shift." Elias Thorne lived another 5 years, long enough to see his grandchildren play in the fields that were no longer a wasteland. When he passed, he was buried next to Silas, under the shadow of the stone house. The story of the Thorne brothers became the DNA of the town. The blood they shed on the threshold didn't just stain the earth, it sanctified it. Their legacy wasn't found in the bank accounts or the railroad stocks, but in the stubborn, unyielding spirit of the people who remained. The frontier was gone, but the grit and dust remained, carved into the very stone of the American heart, a reminder that every civilization is built by those willing to lose everything to gain a foothold for the future.